Welcome back to the Yogi's Roadmap podcast. I'm Shinay Trudeau here with Bhavani Maki for another conversation from the heart. Your attention is the most precious commodity. Thank you so much for choosing to listen in with us today on the Yogi's Roadmap podcast. Bhavani, what a joy and an honor to spend time with you and see your face.
As we say in Greek, episis, which means right back at you. I feel the same way.
So I want to read your words to you and have you expand on them further if you would, please. In your book, you write, the practice of yoga and the experience of being in yoga are one and the same. When I first read these words in your book, I felt a deep sense of relief, like, oh my God, I don't have to work so hard to do yoga. And I keep coming back to this phrase over and over again. Can you say more?
Absolutely. First of all, I can't take credit. That is from Mircea Eliade, who I've mentioned many times. And he was a professor of comparative religions and also delved really deeply into archetypes, themes. He was one of the OGs before Joseph Campbell. He studied shamanism and traditions of original peoples, as well as, kind of consistent themes that reveal. And his book, I just pulled it off the shelf. Now I'm not finding where it is, but it's not a direct translation, a linear translation of the sutra, but it speaks about the shamanic tradition, the indigenous tradition of the Yoga Sutra. So in it, yeah, and he refers to, so it's an interesting thing to relay because there needs to be a certain level of understanding. And actually, as I say that, I think that there's some real import to that because, wow, that sounds really easy, doesn't it? But again, our level of experience and the depth of experience, going from superficial to deep, extrinsic to intrinsic, from the egoic structure even into the relationship structure, depends on our depth of study. And so this is where the yogin commits to a course of regular study. And as I shared, it's like each pada is meant to be studied for 10 years at a time. So, and then that's not like where you're just touching upon it, but regular study. So as you expand your nomenclature, your cosmology, as you begin to really, and it's not just book learning, but there's practice as well. And you're in this state of, learning we do through repetition and the refinement of our questions. Okay. So the word that Patanjali uses and Mircea Eliade uses is samadhi. And of course, samadhi is an umbrella term. So there's a lot of layers. And even if we feel like, oh, I had a super normal experience, or I had a transcendent experience, I had a blissful experience. The beauty of the Yoga Sutra is that he goes into deeper elucidation and helps you to realize, okay, there's more. Let's keep going. So really, a more accurate quote would be, the practice of samadhi is the experience of samadhi. And practice being, to put things into practice. It's not so much like I'm doing a trial run. It's also, of course, practical methodology. We're given, we're taught how the practices are done, and there's plenty of that out in the world. And there's, of course, different skill sets. there's many layers that we can access through that. But then really I forgot what I was going to say there. But also understanding that, when we're working with yoga, as Patanjali says, it's an endless process. Now, the more we invest ourselves in something, the more interested we're going to become. So samadhi is a multi-layered experience. And that's why I love, that's why I'm a lifer. Like, I'm committed to life. And people say, "Oh, why don't you study this tech or that text?" And it's like, I'd rather go half an inch wide and a mile deep. And then it's like you start to connect into, it's almost like I feel like the mitochondria, in which there's this deeper transmission, there's this natural language, and other things really kind of fill in the spaces. So it's not unilateral or limited, but I also know that sometimes things can get so big that it can get confusing. And this works for me. I've seen it work for so many other people. So let's look at the etymology of the word samadhi, which of course is going to be an oversimplification. Sama means to make whole, to put together with. And the etymology of health is whole. It's seeing the bigger picture. And so it's even like recognizing, and this is so beautiful because the sutra fill in these gaps, right? And they're multi-layered, that we're going to even see what's missing and see that as part of our wholeness. The fact that we know things are missing, we may not be able to put our finger onto things, but this is where we start to develop, we go into more of an intuitive state. Many people confuse intuitive state or something as being an intuitive state when in fact they're really in the inertia of patterning. So that, Patanjali says, takes much seasoned inquiry to explore what is authentic and what is really some kind of an embedded vritti or knee-jerk reaction, bias, opinion, or concept. Then we have dihi, which means to hold. It means, it also means to integrate. So it's a continuous state of reintegration because the nature of consciousness is expansive. And expansive doesn't, bigger, meaning it's big enough to hold like all of the minutia as well and the details. And so again, these are things that we can't really describe. It's really about having your own experience. And when you have a guide and you have somebody who's like seasoned in that inquiry, and then you have to have the commitment. You have to have a positive attitude and then stamina. So it's really this kind of like journey without beginning or end. But let's titrate it down again. So if the practice of samadhi, in parentheses yoga, is the experience of samadhi, in parentheses yoga, the putting into practice your continuous integration. And integration means that we're like integrating all the little pieces and the little parts, samadhipada, right? And so it's never a static state. In fact, it's enstatic, in which the profundity, the intensity, as Mircea Eliade describes it, is you realize, kind of like that mitochondria, that there's everything has its place and has its function. And there's this incredible mandala, this energetic nexus, an organism that is not random, but is really like highly refined. I think of it like a Swiss clock, like everything is affecting each other, and there's kind of a sense of balance, and there's transmission happening within that. That we actually, it's so big. And I've quoted from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his book Flow, that the way that the ordinary brain processes information, it's so magnanimous that we can't even hold on to our idea of self. So it's really hard to talk about these things, but luckily we've been given, as my husband Ray put, the indescribable has been well described. And then we go and we put it into practice. And then life will work us and test us and push us to another layer, right? To really see, okay, I thought I was solid there. Well, I need to check again. Or I'm nature is pulling on me to diversify and grow. And that's our next sutra in the Kaivalyapada, in the mentorship.
Thank you so much. Well said. So myself, I am a recovering perfectionist. And I'd wonder if you would give me something to work with, because I'm sure I'm not alone. And the nexus point being, how do I really let go as a person who has, for my whole life, wanted to get it just right?
I think also being a recovering perfectionist, the practice of recovery is the experience of recovery. But let's think about that. What are we recovering? We're recovering our wholeness again. And really what was one of those like soul rewiring moments for me was to realize how I used perfectionism and how perfectionism had been imposed upon me as a means of breaking off intimacy. Just sit with that for a moment. Because when it's never good enough, we don't really have to let someone in or appreciate where they are or who they are. And, I'm so delighted to be finally opening the Kaivalyapada, which again is assuming that you've had lots of integration and practice, let's say 20 years on the first two pada, okay? In the seventh sutra, it says, Karma Shukla Krishnam Yogina Trividam Hitaresham. Akrishna means not black. Ashukla means not white. Karma is no longer black and white. And so when we create these standards, and they're impossible standards, right? The impossible standard of perfection, that's not for us to say. And, as I was sharing in that David White poem on courage this past weekend in Durango, the piece that really landed so deeply for me is that it's only when we look back in life does something look like courage. And maybe the same thing is true for perfection. So Kaivalya, which is this end of striving, That doesn't mean that you don't still do the work and hold a high level. Like there's a difference between perfection and excellence, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
And so excellence is open to feedback. It's penetrable. It realizes there's like joy in refinement. There's joy in um, due diligence, and then really showing up in a way that's not casual, but in a way in which you really are making you're offering into, and you're offering the best that you got at any given moment. And it doesn't mean that you can't do better in the future, but we're not there yet. So, what I feel like where it really landed for me was again realizing how not only was I holding that standard for myself, but where I was also doing it for my husband. And it's like, oh, well, you missed this, or did you do that? And it was like I could just see where I was pushing him away and creating this impenetrable barrier. And then I had to look at how I had turned that in on myself. Um, I love what, in the documentary on Mr. Rogers, and
I love
he
that.
said, it's so great. And one of the, and I grew up on that and it was fantastic. And when you look at the documentary, you realize how many boundaries he pushed. But one thing that he started every show with when he was sitting with, when he was singing to us as little children is, I love you just the way you are. And I remember taking that in, and I was like, I need to say that to my son more. And the first time I said it to him, I could see that like time stopped and something opened up in him. Because, of course, as his parent, it's my duty to instruct him and raise the bar for him, but also to let him know that I think he's like beautiful just the way he is. And we're all a work in progress. So the like slogan or the mantra is about progress and not perfection.
Yeah. What comes to me sometimes is because the yogic texts are full of this word perfection. Um, and maybe you can clarify for me what the Sanskrit word is. I don't know for sure reading. Um, I don't know, but what I've kind of translated it in my mind to is completion or wholeness, which is a very different flavor than perfection. And it's probably just, semantics in my mind, but um, really looking at it more in this way of excellence or, a job well done, or in this way of completion or fullness, like you said, giving it, the best that I have at this point in time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I just quickly asked the oracle because I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. I mean, let's get that clear.
Yeah.
I have sufficient literary fluency to be able to, take the download, the Yoga Sutras, and get what is pertinent to me. So, I'm on like a need to know basis kind of a thing. And so I did just Google it. And the word that, and it's interesting, it came up under the Samskrita for perfection, but it's a Buddhist site. So who knows if it's Pali? I can't even, on the fly here tell you how accurate this is, but it says the word is paramita.
Uh,
Now, I haven't seen like, I haven't seen, and I'd have to do a deeper investigation, the word perfection per se in yoga, it's
Mhm.
often something that is intimated in translations,
Yeah.
isn't it? And
Yeah.
I would agree that it's like sama, which is wholeness.
Yeah.
Para has the same root as the Greek, which means beyond.
Yeah.
So it implies, that it is a progressive thing. It's a sense of polishing. Um, and that polishing, and we all know you polish something and then karmic dust lands on it. So I would have to agree. Um, yeah, and it's really interesting because I think Venkateshananda described it like the most poignantly for me, which is where he said, you got to be careful about labels and words because we put a load on them. Okay. So, depending on our own experience, we then fill in the gaps around the feeling where we heard it, where this maybe it wasn't even said, but it was intimated and there was a standard. And usually it was in regards to not measuring up, or maybe you were the perfect one and it was used in a way passively to
Mhm.
indicate that somebody else was imperfect. So again, it's not black or white. There's a huge gray area. And, you know, yeah. And so I think it's really good to ask these questions. And you brought this up some time ago. And, it's like whenever I use that word, I always put the air quotes, because again, my idea, and this is a huge thing too, my idea of what's perfect may not be somebody else's. My idea of what clean dishes look like versus my child or my husband's might be quite different. So again, it's the standards that are, that we hold. But really, I think it is about, it's that polishing, and it's not about a finished product. It's the love that we put in. It's the care that we put in. And I feel really grateful about that, having had a background in classical music, right?
Mhm.
Like even in your dance,
Yeah.
was it ever perfect? No, but it was good enough.
Mhm.
It was good enough. It was performance worthy. And then there was possibilities for magic.
Yeah.
Then you start to go to another layer, which is like, what is coming through this, and the intention of that. And then even getting lost in the experience. I love how this topic is folding in and out of itself, where we don't even have the idea of being the doer, and it's not even an idea that we have an idea of not being the doer, but we are literally, like in the flow or carried away, or we dissolve into the experience. And that is that sense of ecstasy.
It reminds me of really being present. Like there's no other way to do it except in the moment, and to bring all, like you say often, like all parts of myself forward now. Yoga now, samadhi now. It's happening in this present moment. And where it's like I fall short is when I'm always thinking to the next thing or regretting what I did in the past.
And isn't it wonderful that, like, in the more roots traditions, you always start with an invocation, and I know I do that. It's like when I'm stepping into something big, and I feel that every time I'm sharing yoga, certainly a workshop or a training or a sutra, I'm like calling in all angels, or the beings through which the transmission came in, because I know as much as I'm prepared, there's an energy that takes over. And the more that, if I've done my due diligence, and I'm always way over prepared because I don't want to like be stumped. I know I'm never going to cover it all. Then there's something that starts to happen, and it's like this alchemy of who's present. And so, yeah, I love what you said about bringing all parts of yourself. So, really showing up. And again, I feel like, you know, there's nothing casual about it. This is art. This is something that like I've really explored and developed and practiced and studied, and it's an ongoing thing. It's like any kind of artist. They're not just going to be like, oh, I just need to paint that one masterpiece and finish. They do that, and then there's something inside of them which is like, oh my God, now I've raised the bar. What's next? Um, and that's a healthy tension. Like, okay, there's something that there's, as we spoke about yesterday, that quickening. That's something like flutters inside of us. So, so much of what I love in the sutras is it invites us to reframe these things. It's not bad. It's not good. How do you feel about it? And then to start doing some unearthing behind that. Have you really shown up? And maybe you are doing the work and you are practicing and you don't take it casually, but is it really an offering from your intrinsic self? Also, we can bring in that teaching of like in the Islamic tradition and the prayer carpets, that there was the intention of creating a mistake, because when you create a perfect product, it's almost like you're trying to deify yourself. And I think I shared that, my dad growing up in Greece, and he was, very, very bright young student, that even when he got 100% on an exam, the teachers always knocked a point off.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's beauty in that, like putting a little imperfection or a little, it's like a little signature or a little ink splatter or something. Yeah.
Don't they say that's how God gets in? Is is through that imperfection. I don't know where I heard that, but I know it's in the Native American tradition too. They always weave their tapestries or their carpets or their blankets with a slight imperfection. And I heard that that's how the divine gets in, or that's how yeah.
That's wonderful. I hadn't heard that, but I believe it. And as you say that, I mean, very few things in the natural world are perfectly symmetrical, right?
Yeah.
Even the moon, it's kind of a little bit cattywampus. And I always, when I think of that, I think of my breasts, they're not like identical, or there's always little kind of like nuances and signature to everything, has its own unique personality. So again, this is where we're imposing structures, which then limits the experience. Yeah.
Don't become self-limiting or self-negating. So I've been thinking a lot about specifically in asana practice, but this can be in life too, is going from the detail-oriented work of exactly where to place my hands and, how my shoulders are on my back, to, like you say, the larger field and the more feeling sense. And I know in your own teaching, you've been playing with that. I'm someone who appreciates both the details and the feeling, and I wonder if you can talk more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think this really dovetails nicely into our last podcast, which is like when, they're little up till the age of approximately 12, just let them play and let them enjoy. Um, and then there is about like learning how to navigate your physiology. And so that also, as I was reflecting on this, I thought of the template of the kosha.
Mm.
And so, in the beginning, we're working with Annamaya kosha, the food sheath. So everything that's tangible, right? The musculature, the skeletal system, the skin, etc. And we're just kind of like making these shapes. We're working on with what is tangible and kind of getting to know maybe what's possible, where there's limitations. Are those healthy limitations, or are they something that can be explored and made less, have less tensility, and that maybe there's more choices, and we start to learn, like that there's just basic functionality. That's a hinge joint, that's a ball joint, that's a saddle joint, how things work and how they don't work. And we can relate that also to just kind of having fun and seeing what that vehicle can do. And then we start to shift into pranamaya kosha, which is more our physiological sheath. Okay, we start to explore, wow, if I relax, or I even use PNF, proprioceptive neurofacilitation. I'm in Baddha Konasana, and instead of putting my hands on my thighs to get my thighs to drop, if I resist my thighs into my hands, I'm creating this neuromuscular feedback in which there's a resistance, and it kind of like triggers that Golgi tendon organ release, where the synapse then sends a signal to the fascia to release, and there's kind of a letting down or letting go. And I can work with my physiology. I can also work with my breath. If I breathe in a certain way and I'm calm and I'm relaxed, I have more choices. I can make more shapes. I can explore a greater range of possibilities. And then, of course, when we do that, when we're working with our physiology, we're starting to tap into like, why do I want this so bad? Do I have an idea of perfection? Am I coming from a place of not being enough? Am I competing with someone? Am I competing with myself? So now we're starting to see like what's embedded in our nervous system and the way that these consistent patternings reveal as our personality and how we feel about ourselves and how we move in the world and what is maybe obvious to others but has evaded us. And so by tapping into the breath, now we're starting to touch into the more internal body and the internal sheaths. And this wakes us up to Manamaya kosha, which is really like how I think about things. When we think about things, we do it through vitarka. We do it through words and concepts. So it is what it is, but then I like cast the light of, oh, I like it, or oh, I don't like this, or I want it different, or this is good, or this is bad. We go into that black and white thinking, and we start to observe the discursive mind and the stories that have been told about us, vritti sarupyam itaratra, the stories of who we are, who we're meant to be, how we haven't measured up, or how we are the darling, and all these stories. And then, of course, it's about like investigating these stories and seeing maybe that the truth behind them and the myth behind them, the archetypes and who we are. So we start to begin to investigate our own mind. And then from there, we go into Vijnana Maya kosha, which is the wisdom. As soon as we see the story we're like, wait a minute, that's a story, but is that the story I want to live out? Or wow, there's some truth there. So we start to see things more from a unbiased perspective. And then we go into Anandamaya Kosha, which is kind of like, wow, this is the story without beginning or end. And there's such a bigger story behind it. Like all of these stories lead to deeper questioning. So, I mean, I know that this is a big question, but it felt like a good framework to talk about it. And, I think I know that we have to start somewhere, right? So, where, Patanjali's system is very pragmatic, right? We're starting from Shtula, which is the tangible, the extrinsic, to Sukshma, which is the more subtle intrinsic layers. And, I feel like we gain a certain level of competence in a certain area. And then if we have good teachings and good mentorship, we're going to be like, oh, wow, there's another layer here to explore. And then as we do that, if we're functional, like if we're really practicing yoga as psycho-spiritual maturity, there's going to be some psychotherapy there. There's going to be some curiosity about our personal folklore. And then even the folklore of yoga, the tradition of yoga, right? That's Svadhyaya. Like, whoa, even the Buddha was tested up to his last day. Even the Christ, right? They had to descend. They had to face demons. They had to go into the underworld. And they had to really get clear into what they wanted to make their God or their aspiration, where they were coming from, and develop that sense of commitment, which is even deeper than something that we seeing as believing. It's a deeper kind of a commitment, which is also that commitment to not really knowing and getting comfortable in that place, which for most people brings anxiety. Just tell me what to do. Tell me how it should be done, So like for me, I'm kind of going inside and outside and here and there. And it's like, I'm touching all of these layers, and I don't feel like any part of it is left behind. So fortunately, with enough practice and application and good teachings, as Patanjali says in 247, Prayatna Shaitilyananta Samapatipyam, that eventually, when you've developed enough fluency in your own system and fluency with the teachings, we could say that they're even taken into heart, then it becomes part of our structure. It becomes part of our being. And we don't have to go like let's say somebody who's really skilled at changing the oil on their car, they don't have to open up the manual and read 30 pages on it. They know how to do it, and they're able to, all the time they're innovating. So then we go into this greater integrity. Our parasympathetic nervous system naturally starts to guide us and open up new pathways, and there's a lot of discovery in that. And of course, it's always revealed through our breath. So it's like we got to start somewhere. And every time I start with downward dog, I do the same thing. I check. But then I'm like, oh, there's my obsessive perfectionist. I don't even need to have that thought anymore. And I leave it be. And then I start to explore the thread of movement, and then feel into my breath, and then feel into, then even like in the sutras on pranayama, Patanjali says, then eventually like in pranayama, there's a loosening in the system in which you don't feel yourself as separate in the space. So now I'm feeling like the cosmos breathing through me, and now me isn't even there. And then I feel like, oh, wow, I'm not feeling response in the back half of my pelvic floor. There'll be like a little inkling that comes in. And as soon as I have that inkling, there's a response. And again, it's that polishing sense. There is due diligence again, and that's that first word in the sadhana pada, tapas. You have to be willing to do the work. And if you take it casually, and if you're sporadic, or you think it should be easy, now you can have ease even when it's not easy, right?
Well said.
Yeah. So then it becomes an incredible adventure in which you're discovering things all the time. It's like they say you can't go in the same river twice. So I love how it's that sense of like the psychonaut where you're about to go on this adventure, or even something that Nicola and I have been doing, which has been scuba diving, and in places that I've swam for 30 years. And now I'm starting to go into the underworld, into the fishy world, the ocean world of nature. And it's always changing. So I'm going down there and I'm just kind of like tuning in. And I love how primal it is because um, you you kind of stop being human in that moment. And so as I'm getting into it now, I'm learning how to relax into it more. And also, I always have a trusty guide. I have the dive master. And an amazing thing happened on the last dive. I came out, and of course, you always check your tanks. And both the dive masters were completely floored by how little oxygen I used. They were just like laughing. They just couldn't stop laughing. They were like, we've been doing this for decades. We've never seen anybody use so little air. And I was like, I think I finally figured it out. And it was pulling from the sutras where, when you're underneath, they say breathe naturally, but you're kind of over breathing and you're over moving. The really good divers, they barely move. And I learned how to kick, they say from your hip, but I'm kicking from my psoas. And when you do that, you get so much momentum. And instead of breathing deeply, I focus on complete exhalations. And then I would just pause and relax. And in that relaxation, because you're never really completely emptying your lungs, there's kind of like an expansion of the residual air within you. And then you just take in what you need. So I was actually really breathing and I was like, wow, this is amazing. So then the second dive, I went in and I was like, wow, I've got it down. I used way much more air because the ego is basically all puffed up and needs a lot of air. But it's just amazing, like when we have you know, like a solidity in something, how we can loosen up around it and then really go on that joy ride of like, it's a form of really like calculated play in which you loosen up. I mean, how did any of these beings, these rishis and rishikas, discover anything, right? Or these brilliant luminaries that we look to, the Krishnamacharyas, the Shankaracharyas, the Iyengars, the Deskachars. It's like these, because they were curious. They were curious. So again, we have the metric. What is it? Is it 10,000 hours? Doesn't seem like enough.
Yeah,
Actually,
3 hours a day for 10 years.
uh, I don't know. Maybe, maybe. a very,
I did
very
the
long
math.
time, or they say 7 years of intense study. Who knows? Whatever it is, but there is a point where, um, you've got that dexterity and that fluency and that virtuosity in your body, where then there can be real, like that signature, you know, coming through, and how one conductor will have the orchestra play a piece versus another. That's where the real personality and the rasa, or the juice, or the flavor, like, ooh, that teacher's spicy, or that piece, or that teacher is really cool.
Yeah.
That one's really sharp, that one's really smooth. Yeah.
Wonderful. Anything else in summation? I mean, thank you so much. That was excellent.
Yeah. When we chant, for instance, Gayatri, and I really feel this is where, maybe, this sense of being self-made, or I'm going to go get it, or I'm going to do this thing, where, of course, you have to invest yourself. And of course, the level to which you invest yourself is what you're going to experience. But we are held by something much bigger. And this is why I'm loving this Kaivalyapada. And anybody who wants to jump in, now is the time. It's really so beautiful. It's like where we step into a larger perspective.
And I'll say this is coming out in real time. This will be published March 1st. So you're not too late to jump in. Do it now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a reframing in which you realize, whoa, like this has been seated within me. There's something that's seated within me. And there's like, I have come in with a mission, um, with a sensibility, with a unique strand, and to really follow that and lean into it and trust it. And as Ray put so beautifully, I had him come in and talk to the last trainees, and he was talking about, you know, his experience of yoga. He's been on the yogic path since he was like 19, and he's 61. And he said, what you start to see is like this perfection, I'll say, of synchronicity, that you are at the right place at the right time with the right people. So, Gayatri is where you take a moment and you stop, right? Traditionally, it would be sunrise, noon, and sunset, but it's where you step out of time. This is the second to the last sutra in the Kaivalyapada. And suddenly, when time stops, you realize how everything has been unfolding, like this larger, I'm getting chicken skin, this larger mandala, where suddenly things make sense, the way things that unfolded, even though maybe it wasn't according to your design, there was a bigger design. So by bringing in like these mantras, they synchronize ourselves to another dimension of reality, which, is the chaturtaha, the fourth dimension. Sure, timing is everything. That was our last podcast. But also, if we could step outside of time, which we can, let's say we're planting a seed or something, and we're like just taking a moment to reflect like how all of these elementals are coming together, which will then come into the full bloom. And we may even plant a forest that we won't see in this lifetime. So Gayatri is like where we're stepping outside of time and we're appreciating that there's a bigger arc that we can't really see, but we know it's going to come into its own fullness. And so that wouldn't happen unless there was right here, right now. And for all the people who are obsessed with being present, it doesn't deny where we've come from. And there's so many cycles within cycles. There's so many layers to all of this that it's so big that we lose our idea of ourself, or maybe even ideas of perfection. And there's just this joyful release of being held by this bigger unfolding. That really we are, the eyes of the world. We are the hands, the hearts, the feet of creativity and the creator moving through. And it's what Ray's teacher Ananda Murti would say, it's the spiritualization of the ego. There's still room for growth. There's still room for reflection. And, but there's also like trusting in our own process and knowing that we have the capacity for diligence and that we're not going to shirk that responsibility. So sometimes samadhi is described as a state of readiness and alertness. When you're in that state, you go, wow, I'm in the right place with the right people at the right time. And the raw resources are here. Let's be part of this magic together.
Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Om Hari Om Hari Om. So yeah, like even just taking that moment, Bhavanam, for intention. All right, I'm available. Let's make some magic. Let's make some love. Let's make some beauty.
Thank you.
Thank you.